introduction. So we've kind of already introduced yourself, so we'll let Adam kick us off with what we're going to be talking about.
All right, can folks hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. So the session today, what we're going to be talking about is how as human beings, we all have some very real limitations with our human brains. And how, maybe if we paid attention to those, gave them a little more respect and adjusted the way we work to accommodate those, we might be a little happier, a little more effective, and a little less stressed out. So I think the obvious question is, who the heck are we to be up here talking about this? We had a real neuroscientist earlier today, and I got two consultants. Well, less charitable view would be, well, as consultants, we're pretty good at talking about things we don't know a lot about, which is totally fair. On the other hand, though, this is really great news for y'all because we're not going to use a lot of jargon. We're going to try to stay in our lane. And really, we're just here and excited to talk about something we both feel strongly about. So, what does the next, give you a preview of something here. What does it look like the next half hour or so? We're going to talk about being a human being, having a brain. We're going to establish some terms and some of the common limitations that we all share. Then we're going to talk about what it looks like when we get online and what it looks like when we start to stress those limitations. And then lastly, we're going to explore some of the ways that we can try doing things differently, possible ways to really look at those limitations and with respect, find ways to be more effective with that in mind. So just before we begin, I'm just going to hand it off to Patrick, who has a few fun, exciting notes to share.
So since it's just after lunch, you might be feeling sluggish. We thought we'd keep it interesting, so we have some prizes available for good engaging questions or conversations, so be thinking about that. And kind of on a related note, I actually think this might be easy just kind of scanning the room, but if you're willing to participate, and just as a preface, obviously any work or personal matters, don't worry about it, but if you're willing to participate, I think it'll actually help kind of engage in the content to minimally put away your phone, and if possible, also put away your laptop. And try to notice during the course of the talk how often you feel the pull to check either device. And then we'll kind of circle back at the end and talk about it.
All right, thank you. So, good news, there's only one slide for the first 5 minutes. So we're going to talk a little about being human and our brains. It may surprise you all that the brains we have today are the product of hundreds of millions of years of evolution. And when we started off, we didn't really have these incredible sophisticated brains. We basically had reflex mechanisms. We were responding to external stimuli in our environment with zero processing. Over time, that changed. We started to develop the ability to represent our environment internally inside of our brains. And we were still responding to those representations. We weren't really giving it much thought. We couldn't do that yet. And we can categorize both of these as what we could think of as bottom-up regulation. Now, over many, many millions of years, we developed this ability to pause. So if you were looking at a slide right now, you can see this wonderful graphic we stole from someone smarter than us about this cycle of perception and action. And this ability to pause between perception and action is really where we developed the ability to even form goals, to evaluate, make decisions about what actions we were going to take. Now this is actually incredible, right? Think about the ability to define our goals and think about the way that this has evolved over time. We've developed this ability to form these complex, time-based, sophisticated, often conflicting goals and to somehow achieve these incredible feats as a result. So if you think about great feats of engineering, works of art, symphonies, medical advances, none of this is possible without the ability to actually form and enact goals. So, great, we've all developed this capacity for goal formation. What good is that, though, if we can't actually enact those goals? And so it turns out, what we've learned is that this is a whole different system in our brain that achieves this for us. We can broadly categorize these as cognitive controls. So cognitive controls, we can have 3 categories for our conversation today because, like we said, we're not going to go that deep. We have selective attention, we have working memory, and we have goal management. So we're going to do a 50,000-foot view of each of those. Selective attention, I want to make sure I get this right. It's one of these, attention in general, right? It's a word that gets tossed around all the time. We all know it. It's fundamental to our human experience, and so it feels intuitive. For our conversation today, what we're really talking about is this selective attention, which is this ability to spotlight a certain thing. And when we do that, right, whether it's smells, sensations, perceptions, point in time, what we're doing is we're really amplifying those signals. So whatever it is that's in our brain is being boosted. And at the same time, there's a function of suppression happening as well, where things that are not relevant to our goal in that moment, we're actually dialing down. And this is all happening automatically, and it's part of our selective attention. We'll call it a capability. So I mentioned before this ability to kind of pause and to process something before you do something. Well, when we pause between our perception and action, something has to sustain that perception in our mind. It's gone, right? It's not out there in the world anymore, but we need to be able to process it. And that something is working memory. So working memory is what gives us the ability to persist a perception of an experience after it's passed. And that's where our mind processes it. So without that, we wouldn't be able to actually represent those things we paused on. And so we can think of working memory kind of like the bridge between our perception and our action. And this is the thing that actually allows us to choose goals and to take action on them. So then, goal management. I mentioned before, we all have lots of different goals at any given moment. We always have, we always will. And goal management is really this thing that deals with the fact that all of those goals are competing for the same very limited set of cognitive resources. So you can think of goal management and the ability to manage these goals like a traffic controller. It's basically the thing making sure we stay on one and not go to the other. If you imagine if you had no control over this, you would never get anything done. So that's goal formation, that's goal enactment. There's one more thing I want to talk about before I hand it over to Patrick, and that's goal interference. So goal interference is all the noise that gets in the way of our pursuit of goals. We can think of this like a radio or any other very sensitive instrument. There's a degree of sensitivity to any kind of interference. And this takes on two forms. There's distractions, meaning things that are really happening without any impetus from you, but they're out there or in here. And interruptions, which is when we actually engage with one of those distractions in a conscious way. We switch in some fashion. And each of those can happen both internally and externally. So internally, I'm sure we're all familiar with thoughts that just go through our head at any given moment throughout the day when we're really focused on something else. Externally, maybe it's your phone ringing, maybe it's you're at a restaurant and you hear your name in the background. Those would be two good examples of distraction. An interruption might be if you were to follow that thought, or if you were to tune out the conversation with your dining partner and start trying to listen in on the thing where you thought someone said your name. So, why am I mentioning this? Because our cognitive control systems are extremely sensitive to interference. This has been true for millions of years, so it's not getting any better in any of our lifetimes. Developmentally speaking, we're really not that far away from our closest ancestors in terms of primates. So let's lower our expectations there. What this ultimately means, and what Patrick's going to talk about, is that we have a significant delta between our ability to come up with and form goals and our ability to actually enact those goals. So if you remember one thing from this part of the talk, I hope it's this. Fundamentally, we all have champagne tastes and beer budgets when it comes to our cognitive resources. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Patrick, who's going to tell you how bad it really is.
So, the first limit we're going to talk about is one thing at a time. And it's interesting, research actually shows that people think they can multitask. But in reality, we can only actually do one thing with 100% of our attention at a time. What we're doing, if we're doing anything else, is we're actually switching rapidly between those things. So we're going to do a little exercise kind of as an example. So I want you to say out loud with me the letters A through J pretty quickly. All right, ready? Go. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J. Great. Now we're going to say the numbers 1 through 10, same speed. Ready? Go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right, now we're going to switch between the two a little bit faster. Ready? Go. A, 1, B, 2, C, 3, D, 4. Right? It's a simple task. It seems simple, and all of a sudden you realize that you either make a mistake, or if you can keep going, it takes a little bit longer the further you get along. And that only amplifies as the task becomes more and more complex. The second limit we're going to talk about is 23 minutes. So it might sound familiar. That's about how long a sitcom show is. It's also how long it takes for us to refocus our full attention after switching tasks. And researchers sometimes call this attentional residue. It's kind of a helpful image to think about. Your attention is still kind of stuck on the thing you were attending to, and it takes a lot of cognitive resources to switch to a new task, and there's different neural networks for different tasks. So that time delay can be up to 23 minutes. And then when you talk about switching rapidly between multiple things, especially if they're complex, that only compounds itself. The third thing we're going to talk about is working memory, which Adam mentioned, bridges perception and action. And the easiest example is someone is going to tell you their phone number, and that's an auditory stimuli, it's the perception, and you can remember it, maybe not, you need to repeat it for just long enough to write it down or put it in your phone, right, the action. So the interesting thing is we can only hold somewhere between 3 to 7 things in our working memory. And it's actually attention that is the means by which information even is able to enter our working memory. So if our attention is divided, you can already see how it's possible it might not make it into our working memory, or if it does, we're switching to the next thing and we can only hold so much at a time. So I think a classic example we've probably all experienced is you're upstairs and you think, I need to go down to the basement to get this thing, and you're going down, you get a text message, you check it, and then you run into a kid and you have a quick conversation, and you get into the room and you open the door and you're like, I have no idea why I came down here. I just can't remember. That's kind of a failure of working memory. It's kind of funny. I've been joking with my wife, like, failure of working memory. We keep making these little mistakes, and it's, we're just constantly trying to multitask, and it doesn't work. The last limit is 90 minutes. So there's many different rhythms and cycles in the body, circadian rhythm, digestion, right? And this is an idea that researchers have found that 90 minutes is kind of the optimal amount of time that we can intensely focus on something, after which point we start to fatigue. So there's kind of a benefit to structuring work in such a way that you maximize that 90-minute period, but followed by a period of rest. And that leads into one last thing we want to talk about in this first section, which is focus versus diffuse attention. And there's many different parts of the human brain. It's extremely complex. These are just very relevant, I think, to what we're talking about here today and at this conference. So focused attention is what it sounds like. When you are entirely focused on the task at hand, the best image is like a spotlight. So it's pointed directly at something. And it requires a defined kind of pattern of thinking or series of steps, and it's kind of necessary to execute a task, right? Diffuse attention is kind of the opposite. It's where you're able to relax the mind and not focus on something, and it's actually where our more creative thinking happens, where we're solving problems more creatively, we're making connections between the things that we focus on. And the times you might think of this is when you're in the shower, or walking in nature, or maybe looking at a fire. And so again, there's this kind of rhythm that has to be incorporated into our lives, where we have the ability to focus intensely, but then also have time for more diffuse thinking, right? Because if you're only able to execute, you're not going to come up with creative ways to solve problems. And if you're very creative, but you can't execute, no one's ever going to know you're creative. So with that, we're going to switch into section 2. We're going to talk about now being human online.
All right, thank you, Patrick. Okay, so we're going to do a speed run through the last 10,000 years or so before we get online. So starting back about 8,000 years ago, we all transitioned culturally from a hunter-gatherer society to more agrarian societies. And this was a huge shift. We started, settling down in places and organizing our entire lives differently. Now, 8,000 years go by, and about 300 years ago, we started to move from an agrarian society into a more industrial society. Another huge shift, we started to really just change the way we did everything, and the way that we could even communicate across, continents changed. Now, let's go another 250 years or so into the 1950s, and we start to enter what could be called the information age. The first transistor is invented, and then another 30 years go by, and we have the first computers being used for personal use. So throughout all this time, obviously there's a lot of technological change happening, but you can start to see that there's a compression over time. So then another 10 years go by, and we've got people on the internet. Anybody here have a dial-up connection at 1400 baud when they were younger? You all know. And then more and more time goes by. Then you have email. Suddenly we have way more communication coming in. The friction for communication just keeps going down. Less time goes by. We have mobile devices. Now you don't even have to be at your desk. You can get that email from anywhere where there's a connection. Great. More time goes by, and we have social media. So suddenly, we've had these kind of interest-based bulletin boards for a long time. I remember doing this when I was in high school, configuring these things. They were very focused. It's more of a conversation between a small group. Social media introduces this level of asymmetry that nobody has ever been subjected to before. A few more years go by, less and less. We start to see mobile phones penetrate. Now, today, right, a lot of us either have it in our hand or in our pocket, these always connected devices, and we are just being bombarded by more and more and more communication every year. So, catching up to myself here, I'm going to hand it over to Patrick.
Great. And I apologize. We're going to talk a little bit about what some of the research has shown. I don't have the sources were on the slide, so we'll get those to you afterwards. But we thought it'd be important to ground what we're saying in people smarter than us. So the first piece of research that's worth noting, it comes out of UC Irvine, and found that when it looked at knowledge workers and how frequently they would switch tasks. And what it broke work into two categories. So tasks were kind of like short-term goals, like writing an email, and then working spheres were kind of groups of tasks oriented towards a common goal, like managing a project or coordinating an event. And what they found is that people switch tasks about every 3 minutes, and working spheres about every 11 minutes, which is incredible. We might not reflect on this in our work, but when you can step back and hear those numbers, it's pretty eye-opening how fragmented work can be. The next piece of research looked at the impact of task switching on productivity and found that there was up to a 40% negative impact caused by task switching. So in this exercise, they had young adults categorize geometric shapes or solve math problems, and switching between the two, kind of like we were doing before. And just like you experienced, it took longer as they switched, and the more complex tasks took even longer, and they were more likely to make mistakes, which leads into kind of this third research that I looked at, where they found that the likelihood in a frequent multitasking led to a likelihood of up to 50% increase in likelihood of errors, which is amazing, right? So they had people try to work on concurrent tasks, and then what happened was, when they would make a mistake, they called it attention tunneling. They would focus their attention on the error, and then it actually made them more likely to make a subsequent error. And so that likelihood shot up to 50%, especially in more complex environments. And then the last piece of research looked at what happens in these environments where there's frequent task switching. People actually develop a mode of working where they are working faster, they're writing less, and there's an increase in stress, and there's more time pressure. So you can kind of see how these are all connected, right? The frequent task switching leads to a negative impact on productivity, leads to the likelihood of errors shooting up, and then the stress. So then the question is, what are we going to do about it? So in section 3, we're going to talk about some human-centric strategies for what to do.
Awesome. I don't know how you have that all memorized. That is sick.
I have a 4-month-old son, and he's a very captive audience. He was both crying at me and falling asleep as I was practicing.
I often cry when we play this. So yeah, the first two sections laid out two main ideas, right? First, as human beings, despite how incredible our brains are, we really do have some very concrete, very common shared limitations. And this is especially true when it relates to our sensitivity to interference. And then the second section, over the past couple decades especially, the rate of technological advancement has been progressing. And this has led to a lot more potential sources of interference. Particularly now with these asymmetrically connected digital communication tools that we all use. And yet our human limitations really are the same as they've been for thousands of years. So this last section will be a little bit more optimistic because what we're going to propose is that we all do have some say in the matter, right? These are choices we make in how we engage with these things. And we can make other choices about if we use these tools, when we use them, how we use them, and what we use them for. So speaking of limitations, we're trying to get this done as quickly as possible so you all can ask questions and get brains. So I'm going to hand it over to Patrick.
Yeah, so the first strategy we want to talk about is thinking at more of a meta level about our work. I think we all fall into the trap of just jumping into work to get it done, and often this can be counterproductive. I think it's only when we can set clear goals that we can then see the interference and the distractions. And so, it's having that kind of introspection and ability to step back and think about our work at this level, I think really helps to form clear goals so that as we're working, we can perceive those the interference and distraction. And the second thing we want to talk about is reevaluating tools in terms of whether or not they serve our goals. So I think a good example of this is, let's say you wanted to develop 3 friendships in your life to be kind of deeper relationships over the course of the next year. And you might have different methods to do that. So you could have coffee or get dinner in person. You might use a tool like an application like Facebook. There might be other means that you use to keep in touch with your friends. And then you can step back and evaluate those different methods for accomplishing your goal of deeper friendships based on pretty objectively, right? Like, how much time do I spend in person? Maybe half an hour, an hour a week, maybe. How much time do I spend on Facebook? 4 hours a week? More? Is that helping move the ball forward towards that goal? What would happen if I reallocated just an hour a week to the in-person interaction? And I think we can apply the same to tools we use for business. So something, especially tools that maybe we don't think about, like Slack or Teams, something that we all have to probably use, maybe both. I think it takes a real empathy and people first kind of perspective to think before you Slack and ask questions like, is this really the right medium to be using for this communication? Like, does this really need to be a near real-time response from somebody? Or might it be better to put in a Jira ticket or send an email or wait until I can have a one-on-one meeting with this person and talk through a list of things, right? Because I think it's all too easy. We just reflexively use tools a lot of times without thinking about how they serve our goals. But we can apply that same kind of strategy to tools that we use every day, even things that seem like we have to use them, right? Like Slack or email.
So another way we can think about this is that we have the freedom to experiment with different ways of working. We can try to find ways to sort of keep our spotlight focused and at the same time minimize that interference from internal and external sources so that maybe we have a chance of achieving some of our goals. A good example of this many of you may be familiar with would be something like the Pomodoro technique. Very simply, it says set a timer for 25 minutes, try to work, stay focused, and then when you're done, take a 5-minute break. Before you actually get started, of course, you're going to want to close those 50 tabs, maybe hide your phone somewhere, maybe make sure that you don't have any outstanding things that you're supposed to be doing at that moment. So why might that be helpful? If we think about it in this context of interference and cognitive control, first of all, we're clearly identifying the goals we work towards. So we're kind of setting up an explicit goal. Second, the time boxing helps to actually reduce the interference, right? When we know that we're going to do something for a certain amount of time, we're less likely to be worried or thinking about, I'm supposed to be working on something else right now, or I have these 10 other things I need to do. It may not surprise anyone that anxiety is like putting the pedal to the metal when it comes to interference. And then the actual process of closing tabs, hiding your phone, thank you. All these things we do, they function like a ritual, right? We are to some extent animals, and we are easily conditioned. As anybody who's kind of heard their phone alert or their Slack alert and felt their heartbeat pick up a little bit would know. So these can all be signals for us, and we're going to go into this kind of focused mode, and we'll come back to that other stuff a little bit later.
Another strategy, it was great to hear Mark talk about Atlassian, some of their ways of approaching work. And I was really encouraged to hear they have this kind of asynchronous communication goals that I'd like to look up. But thinking about something like a work capture tool or other tools as a way to, in this context, like, again, how can I maybe move the conversation into a different context where, so from a work, like a Jira perspective, right, instead of an 80 thread, a thread with 80 replies deep, back and forth where you're trying to work out requirements, maybe that conversation can be in a Jira ticket where, the whole team can see it if you get moved off the project or you're out sick, right, and it's in the context of the work, but also from this perspective, right, email and, Jira type systems have a benefit of being able to then batch some of that kind of response. So rather than being available in near real time for any and all questions, you can focus for an intense period on work, on meaningful, deep work, and then you can have a period where you address those kinds of things in more of a batched approach.
About planning.
Yeah.
Excellent planning right here. Planning, it might feel like one of those things that's super obvious, so why are we going to talk about it at this? Shouldn't we be doing something innovative with AI now? So I think it's a useful tool, though, for reducing interference and setting ourselves up structurally to go towards our goals. So it's useful, first of all, to ensure that you're actually prioritizing what's important. When you take the time to come up with a plan first, you're kind of compelled to first think about, well, what do I actually want to do? What's the most important thing for me right now? And that helps, right? You think about, okay, what are my goals? How am I going to make progress? It also helps you pick which of those goals you're going to make progress on. I don't know about any of you. I usually have about 50 to 60 goals that I know about. There's probably another 25 I'm going to find out about on my next call. So this is a helpful way to also deal with the fact that when I find out about those 25 other goals, I can respond to that and contextualize that based on the priorities I've already established. If I need to change things, fine, but at least I'm doing that within the context of saying, okay, I know what my priorities are, I know what my long-term goals are here, I'm going to make choices to support those goals. Doing this kind of planning, it really does help to, I think, direct our attention in a meaningful way. Now, before I hand it back over to Patrick, I do want to mention that this planning can take place at many different levels, but I think the two obvious ones for a lot of us are going to be both, meetings. How many people have joined a meeting with zero agenda in the last month? And did you love it? The other one is obviously just planning out your day. So taking the time to just think through your day ahead of time. I know some of us have to be more reactive than others, but when we take the time to plan out our day in alignment with our priorities, it helps to kind of set that intention early on, and we can come back to that when we start to get a little bit adrift one way or the other. And this helps to, I think, reduce that interference because we end up at a point where we have less ambiguous tasks that we're working with. And our timelines are directly linked to the things we've already decided are important. And that means less worrying about if you're supposed to be doing something else right now. I'll hand it off to Patrick to wrap this up.
Yeah, so one more strategy is employing rituals. So rituals help send signals to the brain that you're about to begin or end something. I employ these all the time. I have 5 kids. So morning routine, nighttime routine, we all have rituals in our life that help drive certain actions, right? And so we can employ these in our work too. When beginning work, like Adam was kind of mentioning, things like putting your phone away, closing unnecessary browser tabs, especially if you're going to begin a period of intense focus on a particular task, think are really helpful signals that you're not going to give in to some other distraction or interference, right? For those of you that use Slack, I don't know if you've experimented with the focus mode. I love it. You can have VIPs, so when my manager Chris messages me, I can still find out about that if I need to. But otherwise, I can just focus for a defined period of time. You set the amount of time, and then after it's done, it goes back to kind of normal mode. Ending your workday is another time where rituals can actually really benefit you. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of something called the Zeigarnik effect, but it's basically this idea that we remember unfinished tasks more than we remember finished ones. And so the idea is to close out any loops that are open before you end your workday. So this is Cal Newport is the one that I picked this up from. It's kind of a shutdown process. So you can basically check Slack, check email, check the calendar for the next day, kind of get a sense for what's coming up. Get anything that's in your head that came up during the day out of your head into some list or into a work capture tool. And, whatever other things that are kind of a part of your workflow, do them, and then say out loud, especially those of you that work from home because it's less embarrassing, shut down complete. Close your laptop and walk away. It sounds silly, but then later when you're, going about your evening and you think, did I finish that? You can just remind yourself, I went through the shutdown process. I wouldn't have done that unless I finished everything. And what it does is, you need that time for diffuse thinking. You can trust that your brain is actually forming connections, helping to solve problems the next day, even more effectively than if you were kind of continually re-engaging with your work. And with that, we're going to wrap things up.
All right, so quick time check. We're actually going to have time for questions. That was the big word here. So part one, champagne tastes, beer budgets, extremely sensitive to interference. Part two, the amount of information coming at all of us has skyrocketed over the past few decades. A lot of instances, that information is actually engineered to be as attention-grabbing as possible, which means it takes more of our cognitive resources to deal with it, whether we're going to attend to it or suppress it. In part three, we talked about what might be seen as a controversial step of suggesting you don't have to check Slack every time it goes off. You don't have to look at your phone every minute. And we could make different choices about how we're engaging with technology. We could try to reduce the amount of context switching, the interference, the general scatteredness that a lot of us feel every day. I think suggesting that we have a choice in the matter may be obvious. It may also feel a little bit, iconoclastic at times. So I think, the thing is, when we think about these choices, we need to keep those limitations in mind. How we can use those limitations and how we can structure our work to either help or hinder ourselves, knowing those things exist. We think that really by doing this and by taking a careful look at these types of choices, we can end up with a more human-centric way of working for all of us. So why did we do this at all? Why do this event called the Innovation Summit? We have a lot of motivations, most of which we won't admit to in public, but there is two that we want to speak to here. First of all, we think that recognizing the dynamics of this issue opens up some opportunities for innovation. A lot of innovation comes from problem solving. So if we look at this as a problem that we have and that we could solve, then there's all these possibilities out there to just, let's find new ways of working. This could be a competitive edge. You can be more effective. You can set up your organizations to be more effective and reduce that interference. No one's immune from it. And secondly, Patrick's mentioned a few times this idea of focus and diffuse thinking. So when we think of innovation, part of it is this ability to come up with creative new ways of thinking about things, connecting perhaps two ideas that aren't related, but maybe they're getting close, what Stephen Johnson calls the adjacent possible. And so when we give ourselves the time, and we give ourselves the opportunity to both focus, as Patrick has mentioned, and we also give ourselves that space to unfocus, to let our minds wander, to brush our teeth without having to think about work, to take a shower, to go for a walk in the woods, to light a building on fire, as Patrick likes to do. Then this is also creating a fertile substrate for all of us to be more innovative in our everyday life. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Patrick for a wrap-up.
Great. So we want to check in and see how it went. What was your experience like and I know it's kind of vulnerable if anybody would be willing to share. Like we mentioned, we have some prizes here, so in terms of checking your phone or your laptop, I don't know if anybody felt the pull during the talk or has anything, has experienced, that and has wrestled with it. So, start there.
Time check. I haven't heard of how far we are published.
Yeah.
To me, it was a tiny thing. Was it interesting?
Yeah. Yeah.
What time do I have?
Yeah.
And what are they going to have? Not that I'm looking forward to what's next.
Great.
But I think that I wasn't interested in this.
Yeah.
It's the time table.
Yeah. And I think that's, I don't know, personally, I always am wrestling with, like, what's, again, the right tool. I just recently got an analog watch, and I have a Whoop strap. I don't know if you're familiar, but it doesn't have a screen. So I like the combination of, like, being able to track metrics without having the screen. Functionally does what I need. It has a date, has a light, and a time. It's not, obviously there's multiple ways to do it, but I just find, checking my phone, I'm more likely to then, I missed a text message, jump into it. So, these kind of things are a constant, question of personal, maybe you have more some people, you're like, I don't need to, I get like 1,000 notifications, I don't look at any of them, but I see that notification, like, I have to check it. So, yeah.
Now I have a whole bunch of those. I could be more.
Yeah.
What time is it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like I was able to focus because I was focusing on you guys. If I would pick up my phone and saw something, it would lead to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing. And it's I think that helped that you mentioned set your phone aside. Set your phone aside and see how you do. It's really, it didn't belong to that. It would have been all by.
Yeah.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that explicit goal of not having that interruption there, that source of distraction, actually helped you to stay focused. Is that right? And that's the case a lot of times, right? It's all the decisions we make and all these choices that we make about what we're going to do, how we're going to set up our environment, they really do play a huge role in how successful we'll be when we actually try to do these other things.
I'm gonna get back to the watch because I had, and I don't wear a watch anymore. Because it actually made me feel guilty about what I wasn't doing. Like, did you get your steps in? Did you, and these messages are coming through. And it was just more, anxiety than it was certainly worth. And it's sitting at home and it needs to be charged. But I don't know what to charge it because it's just not worth it.
Yeah. One of the things I was talking to my wife about recently is I think, like, a good measure, I think, to me, of, like, how much autonomy you have is, like, if you can have that kind of distance from a tool or technology to evaluate whether or not it's, helping or hurting whatever goals you have. And I think we're all wrestling with that in different ways, and especially, it's easy to adopt new technology, and then it's hard to be really introspective and ask those kind of hard questions. But yeah.
Especially when everyone else has it,
Yeah.
It's like you're sitting in a meeting and everyone's doing this.
Yep. Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
over here.
Yeah. I was just thinking too, like, about this goal thing. One of the questions I kind of wanted to ask is how much people might think about the way we work influencing the way we live outside of work, right? So if you're constantly checking email, Slack, working, email, working, right? When you walk away, you're going to be thinking in that same kind of pattern. I need to check my phone. Where, for me, I go upstairs, my goal has to be my relationship with my wife, my relationship with my kids. And if I'm not practicing that in my work, it's hard to make that transition.
Yeah, I think ultimately a lot of us probably need to be more intentional about getting away from these technologies, more clear with ourselves about how we want to operate in the world. Much like you, I have a Fitbit. I think I stopped charging it in 2021, and my life got better. I usually hide my phone when I'm working from home. I'll put it under like a cushion or something. Unless I need to like 2FA somewhere, I'm not looking at it. My life got better. I think that there's just this often urge, and it can be a sense of like, I'm going to miss out on something important. Generally speaking, we're not. It feels that way. And so often what happens is that we get drawn to those other things, and as a result, we're not actually doing the things and making progress on the things we already actually decided we know are important.
I think the whole ending the day and seeing shut down is pretty cool. Because I find myself actually thinking about work right around the time I do this. Yeah, I'm just thinking about what I'll do tomorrow. Yeah, what are the things I need to pay attention to? What I'm going to tell my boss about something that happened. And even though I cannot practice that because I go to I'll shut down everyone.
Yeah, you can say it quietly.
I'll probably try to my cue, but yeah, I think that's a good takeaway.
Yeah. Cal Newport, check out his stuff. He's incredible author. A lot of great content and ideas like that. So, yeah.
Just to follow up, I don't say shut down complete. I say I've done all I can do for the city today, and then I close my laptop and phone. Yeah. And I think that was a product of having like multiple clients. And so like I would end one thing with a client and then focus on a different client. So yeah, that's something I still do. Yeah, I like that. So shut down.
Yeah. It's more mission oriented. I like that.
Like he's Batman. He's like, I've done all I can do for the city.
Yeah, exactly.
I thought Jess was going to respond. Yeah, I think what's interesting about it is this whole idea. Cal Newport got it from what's called acceptance commitment therapy, which is this idea that people that have a lot of anxiety, often what they need to do is get to a place where they've fought through these things that are giving them a lot of grief, and they can go back to this when they find these intrusive thoughts coming up. Well, we all have a lot of anxiety. It's a fact of human existence. It's probably higher now for a lot of us. And so this is a mechanism that works, right? These thoughts are inherently intrusive because we're trying to do something else. And we're being kept awake, and we're not having the pleasant toothbrushing experience you might want to have. So it's fascinating, but ultimately, right, whatever you say, the main idea is you're closing these loops in a conscious, explicit fashion. So it's just very effective.
I think it's focusing on what distracts. I think it makes a big difference just being aware of how distractions affect you. I know we've all seen a lot of people rail against smartphones and how horrible they are. They can be horrible in the wrong context. I mean, I think 10 years ago, if I was running a meeting and I asked people to put away their cell phones, I'd get a mixed reaction. Now, if I say, let's put away our cell phones for this meeting, I can actually see people scowling at me when I request that. It's kind of a how dare you. But just on a personal level, I mean, I understand because it's a process I'm going through, realizing just how my distractions affect me. Recently, I got to a point where it was just hard to concentrate on anything. And I just took a suggestion from my wife. She said, I think you need to go on a media fast. Yeah. Put away your cell phone. I did it for a week. No listening to it, nothing except actually making calls. Yeah. And it was amazing how my head started to clear. Yeah. But it's an ongoing process.
Yeah, for sure. We have about 60 seconds. That's all we're in.
No, I just think the 23 minutes, I hadn't heard that before, and that I'm constantly shifting gears, and it just really made me think about, I never really get out of one task and into the other before I switch again. And so I think that just really resonated with me, and going forward, I think I'll be much more thoughtful of how often I'm shifting gears. It's awesome.
Okay. Well, I think we're just about out of time here, and we do have a QR code that it's a GitHub repository. There's a bunch of links to. Yeah, you can take out your phone now. Yeah. So if you're interested, like Cal Newport, some of the other authors and people who have been influential with that overnight. There's some links to their content. And yeah, thank you all for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day.